smoke still clung to the air, heavy and bitter, curling between the blackened stones. Every step crunched on ash. The Marian center of the Holy Spirit, once alive with candlelight and quiet prayers, was now nothing but ruins, twisted beams, shattered glass, and walls stained black by fire. But in the middle of it all, she was still there. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood as if the flames had passed her by. Her robes were white, untouched by soot. Her hands were folded in prayer, her face calm, almost peaceful. Around her feet, the ground was clean, as though the fire had stopped at an invisible line. It was the morning of September 24th, 2024. For days, the mountains of Cordoba had been burning. Wildfires had raged across the hills, pushed by strong winds, devouring everything in their path. They had eaten through pine forests and farmland, leapt across dry roads, and sent whole villages running for safety. The Marian center had stood in their way. Up in the hills, it was more than just a building. It was a place people came to escape the noise of life, to think, to pray, to find some peace. The statue in its heart had watched over them for years. The night before, the sky above the center had glowed orange. Wind roared through the mountains, carrying embers like sparks from a forge. The firefighters already knew they couldn't save the building. They tried anyway, aiming jets of water into the heat, but the flames were faster. Inside, the altar cloths caught fire in seconds. Wooden beams cracked and fell. Glass windows exploded, scattering shards across the floor. Smoke poured through the sanctuary until it was impossible to see anything at all. No one thought the statue could survive. By dawn, the fire had moved on, leaving silence behind. The firefighters came back to check for hot spots, stamping out embers, moving slowly through the wreckage. And that's when they saw her. The statue was standing exactly where it had always stood. Not burned, not even stained. The morning sun touched her robes, and for a moment, she seemed to shine even brighter against the darkness around her. One of the firefighters took out a phone and snapped a picture. It was the kind of sight you couldn't keep to yourself. Before noon, that image was everywhere across social media, in group chats, on the news. Some called it a miracle. Others searched for an explanation. But for the people who stood there that morning, breathing in the smell of ash and looking at that untouched white statue, there was no doubt about what they were seeing. It wasn't just stone. It was a sign. The Marian center of the Holy Spirit had never been grand or famous. It didn't have towering spires or golden altars. It was simple whitewashed walls, wooden benches polished smooth by years of use, and the scent of candles that always seemed to linger in the air. It sat high in the mountains, where the wind carried the sound of church bells farther than voices. People came here when they needed quiet, when they wanted to be close to God without distraction. Pilgrims hiked the winding paths, carrying flowers for the Virgin, or just their burdens, hoping to leave some of that weight behind when they went home. The statue at the center of it all wasn't large. She stood about the height of an adult, her robe carved with gentle folds, her head slightly bowed. Her hands were pressed together, her eyes lowered as if she were listening. Over the years, she had watched prayers whispered through tears, weddings celebrated in joy, and candles lit for loved ones who never came back. In the week before the fire, the mountains had been restless. The heat of summer still clung to the land, and the ground was dry, thirsty for rain that never came. The news spoke of wildfires in the north fast, fierce and unpredictable. Locals knew the danger. Up here, one spark was all it took. On September 24th, the wind began to change. It came from the east, hot and sharp, carrying a smell that made people uneasy. By late afternoon, The sky had turned the color of copper. The sun was just a dim circle behind a veil of smoke. Fire crews were already stretched thin, battling blazes across the region. When the call came that the fire was moving toward the Marian Center, they moved fast, but not fast enough. The flames were coming from both sides, funneled by the shape of the hills, and the center sat right in their path. By evening, the mountain was alive with fire. Pines exploded as the heat reached them, sending showers of sparks into the air. The wind howled, pushing the flames uphill faster than a person could run. The Marian Center was surrounded. Inside, the statue stood in the half-light, candles flickering weakly against the smoke. The wooden beams above her creaked under the heat. The air shimmered, heavy and suffocating. From outside, firefighters could see the roof glowing from within. They tried to make a path through the flames, but each time they moved forward, a gust of wind would sweep fire into their way. The building was lost. They pulled back, focusing on protecting the trees farther down the slope. Behind them, the Marian Center burned. Flames leapt from the windows, sparks twisting into the dark sky. No one knew what, if anything, would be left by morning. The night swallowed the Marian Center in fire. From the hillside below, the building was a silhouette wrapped in orange and red, its edges blurring in the heat. The sound was constant, the crack of timber, the hiss of burning paint, the low, rolling roar of the flames as they consumed everything in their reach. The walls around her glowed red from the heat. The wooden floor cracked and split, the sound echoing in the chaos. If she had been made of anything ordinary, the fire should have already taken her. Hours passed before the flames began to die down. The fire moved on to the next ridge, leaving behind the hollowed shell of the sanctuary. What had once been a place of peace and prayer was now a skeleton of blackened beams and ash. By the time the photo reached social media, it had already begun to spread beyond Cordoba. Comments poured in, some calling it a miracle, others looking for explanations. But for the people who saw it in person, explanations didn't matter. They had been there when the fire destroyed everything. They knew what should have happened. That morning, villagers climbed the hill to see for themselves. They brought flowers and laid them at her feet. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stood, letting the sight sink in. Amid the ruin, the statue stood as a quiet reminder. Even in the heart of destruction, something pure had endured. 9 years before the fire in Cordoba, another blaze broke out hundreds of kilometers away, not in a mountain sanctuary, but on a quiet military base outside Madrid. It was July 30th, 2015. The base sat on open land, surrounded by low hills and dry grass that had been baking under the summer sun for weeks. Soldiers went about their daily routines, maintenance on vehicles, drills in the training yard, the usual rhythm of a place that ran on discipline. But that afternoon, a fire started. No one remembers the exact spark, maybe a piece of equipment overheating, maybe a stray ember from somewhere else. All anyone knows is that the flames took hold fast. The wind was just right, or just wrong, to carry the fire across the base in minutes. Alarms went up. Soldiers scrambled to move equipment, secure ammunition, and keep the flames from reaching fuel stores. The smoke was thick, stinging eyes and burning lungs. Even for men trained to keep their heads under pressure, there was a moment of panic. By evening, the fire had torn through the area. It left behind a landscape that looked like it had been painted in shades of black and gray. Grass had been burned to ash. Metal was scorched and twisted. Wooden crates were reduced to char. When the flames were finally out, a group of soldiers walked the grounds, checking for hotspots. That's when they saw something that made them stop in their tracks. In the center of a blackened stretch of land, stood a small statue of Our Lady of Lourdes. She was white, carved with a gentle face and flowing robes, hands pressed together in prayer. And she was untouched. Not a scorch mark, not a chip. The paint on her robe was still bright. Around her, the grass was still green. There were even vases of flowers at her feet, fresh, vibrant, petals uncurled, as if they'd just been placed there. It didn't make sense. Everything around her was destroyed. The heat had been strong enough to warp metal, and yet here she was, looking exactly as she always had. Some of the soldiers didn't even know the statue was there until that moment. It had stood quietly in that spot for years, unnoticed by many. But now, in the middle of devastation, it was the only thing left standing in color. They called others over. No one spoke at first. They just stared, glancing from the green grass to the scorched earth, only a few steps away. One of them finally said what they were all thinking. This shouldn't be here. The soldiers stood there longer than they realized, the late summer sun lowering behind them. They'd seen damage before, training accidents, controlled demolitions, the aftermath of field exercises, but nothing like this. Fire doesn't stop neatly. It doesn't skip over patches of grass or leave flowers untouched when it has already destroyed stronger things. Yet here, in the middle of a charred field, the green grass looked like it had been watered that morning. The flowers, bright reds, soft whites, yellows like drops of sunlight, looked as if they had just been placed at the Virgin's feet minutes ago. The only movement was the warm breeze, shifting a few petals gently against the vase. One soldier knelt down, running his hand over the grass. It was cool, damp even. He looked up at the others, shaking his head with a puzzled half smile. Another walked slowly in a circle, tracing the boundary where the green ended and the ash began. It was a perfect ring, as though drawn by an unseen hand. Inside it, untouched life. Outside, nothing but blackened earth. Nobody said the word miracle out loud, not at first, but the thought hung there in the silence between them. Later that evening, when the initial shock faded, one of the soldiers took out his phone and snapped a few pictures. The images captured the contrast, the black field, the fresh green circle, and the white figure in the center, serene and unbothered. Those pictures didn't stay on the base for long. By the next morning, they were on social media. First in group chats among friends and family, then on local pages, then passed on to Catholic communities across Spain. Along with the photos came the questions. How could the statue remain untouched when even the nearby metal was warped from heat? Why were the flowers still fresh, not even wilted by the intense temperature? Why was the grass alive inside that perfect circle, when just inches away it was gone? Skeptics online suggested tricks. Maybe the photo was edited. Maybe someone placed the statue there after the fire. But soldiers on the base pushed back. They explained that the statue had been there before, quietly sitting in that spot for years. And the men who had been on site when the flames swept through confirmed that no one had moved it. Even more strangely, several of the soldiers admitted they hadn't even remembered the statue existed until they found it again after the fire. For some, that fact alone was unsettling, as if the Virgin had stayed hidden until the right moment to reveal herself. By the end of the week, the story had reached national news. Not everyone believed it, but everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever happened that day, it had left an image that would not be easily forgotten, a small, white figure standing calm in the middle of a blackened world. In the days after the fire, the story of the untouched statue kept spreading. It reached Catholic news outlets, was discussed on radio programs, and even drew interest from local TV crews. But along with curiosity came skepticism. Some people wanted proof. They asked for closer photographs, for official reports, for anything that could explain why the fire had stopped so cleanly. Others claimed it must be a coincidence. Maybe the wind changed at the last second, or the moisture in the soil around the statue kept the flames at bay. The military, while not making any theological statements, confirmed certain facts. Yes, the fire had destroyed everything in the immediate area except the statue, the flowers, and the grass immediately surrounding it. Yes, the photos were real. No, the statue had not been moved after the fire. It had stood in that exact spot before the first spark. Reporters who visited the site saw for themselves the sharp line where the damage stopped. They also spoke to the soldiers who'd found it. One, still visibly moved, told them quietly, "I'm not a religious man, but I know what I saw and I can't explain it." As the days turned into weeks, the statue became a quiet point of pilgrimage. Off-duty soldiers would come by to leave flowers. A few civilians, family members of the base's personnel, were allowed in to see it for themselves. No special ceremony was held, no public declaration made. But the story had already taken on a life of its own. For many who heard it, the Madrid fire echoed something deep in the human heart, the idea that in the middle of chaos, there can be a place that remains untouched, a place of peace, even when the world is burning. That same thought had been on people's minds in September 2024, when another statue, this one high in the Cordoba mountains, was found standing pure white in the ashes of a destroyed sanctuary. Two different fires, 9 years apart, miles away from each other. Two different statues, but the same result. Untouched, surrounded by life in the middle of destruction. For believers, these events were not coincidences. They were signs, reminders that Mary, called in Catholic tradition the refuge of the afflicted and comfort of the faithful, still watches over her children. For others, the stories were mysteries, the kind that resist explanation but linger in the mind. In the end, whether one saw them as miracles or as rare alignments of circumstance, both the Madrid and Cordoba events left a powerful image behind. A small, white figure standing calm while the world around her turned to ash. And maybe that's why these stories stay with us, because deep down, we all long for something or someone that will remain when everything else falls apart. For some, that figure is the Virgin Mary, her hands folded in prayer, her gaze steady and unafraid. No matter how high the flames rise, fires don't show mercy. They move without hesitation, without thought for what they consume. Wood, stone, steel, if the heat is high enough, nothing is safe. That's why these two moments in Cordoba in 2024 and near Madrid in 2015 still draw people in. Because what should have been gone remained. In Cordoba, it was a sanctuary in the mountains, reduced to ash in a single night, except for the pure white statue at its center. In Madrid, it was a military base, blackened and silent after a sudden blaze, except for a small figure of Our Lady of Lourdes, standing in a circle of green grass and fresh flowers. Different places, different people, different years, but the same strange image. Some will say it was chance. Maybe the wind shifted at the right moment. Maybe the flames met just enough moisture in the soil to die out before they reached the statue. Science offers possibilities, but what it can't explain is why the sight of these untouched figures stays with people long after the ashes have cooled. For those who believe, it's more than luck. It's a sign, a reminder that in the middle of destruction, there is still a place where peace stands untouched. Mary, in Catholic tradition, is often called the Star of the Sea, a guide through storms, a light when the night is darkest. And in these stories, that light didn't just guide, it stood its ground. Imagine what it must have felt like for the first person to see the Cordoba statue that morning, to walk through blackened ruins, the smell of smoke still in the air, and then see her calm, white, untouched. Or the soldiers in Madrid, stepping across a field that looked like the surface of another planet, only to find a perfect circle of life around a praying figure. These aren't just stories about objects surviving fire. They're stories about what we hold on to when everything else is falling apart. They're about the human longing for a sign that we are not abandoned. Maybe that's why these images spread so quickly. Not because everyone who saw them believed in miracles, but because everyone wants to believe there's something in this world that can stand through the fire and come out unchanged. For some, that something is faith. For others, it's the love of family or a promise they refuse to break. And for many in these moments, it was Mary, a mother watching over her children, even in the worst of nights. The fires in Cordoba and Madrid burned hot and fast, but they didn't take everything. They left behind two statues, standing as they had before, their gaze steady, their hands folded. And maybe, in a way, they left behind a message too, that no matter how high the flames rise, there can still be something untouched at the center of it all.